Inside a funeral, silence is carrying the whole building on its back. And then one person decides this is the perfect moment to freestyle. A chapel, a graveside tent, a folding chair reception hall. It does not matter. The bad line still lands like a dropped tray. These are 101 funeral sentences that should have stayed behind someone's teeth. 1. While hugging the widow beside a table full of framed photos, a man looked at the body, nodded once, and said, "Honestly, he looks better without the oxygen tubes." 3 people froze mid-tissue. One ant turned so fast her shoe squeaked on the tile. Nothing says comforting presence like reviewing a corpse the way you review a kitchen renovation. 2. When the minister asked everyone to bow their heads, a cousin leaned across the aisle and whispered, far too clearly. So are we thinking burial body or just the suit stuffed, right? 6 nearby shoulders started shaking for the wrong reason. The widow stared straight ahead. Even the organ player stopped moving for half a beat. 3. Standing near the open casket, a coworker tried to sound practical and said, "At least he finally lost the weight." Funeral rooms amplify sharp consonants against hard walls, which is why one stupid sentence can travel farther than a careful speech. The daughter closed her eyes. Somewhere behind her, a paper program folded like a tiny act of self-defense. 4. Before the eulogy even started, 2 men in black coats studied the flower spray, and one said, "You think the family got a discount because it's Tuesday." Heads turned in sequence like a slow mechanical ride. The florist, who had come to pay respects, was standing 6 feet away. He spent the next 10 minutes adjusting ribbons with the face of a hostage. 5. During the receiving line, a neighbor squeezed the son's shoulder and announced, "Well, at least parking was easy." He said it with the warm satisfaction of a man reviewing a grocery store. The son blinked once, still holding a sympathy card. The automatic doors opened behind them. Even the hearse outside looked like it wanted to keep rolling. 6. At the graveside, while the wind kept flipping programs open, an uncle peered into the lowered vault and asked, "So how long before the ground really settles?" The funeral director kept the professional expression of a man balancing glassware on a tray. A woman in pearls made a sound like a cough and a prayer colliding in her throat. 7. Before the slideshow began, a family friend glanced at the screensaver photo and said, "That haircut was brave." He pointed at the deceased with the casual confidence of a barber discussing old mistakes. 3 grandchildren were sitting directly behind him. The first piano note hit the speakers at the exact moment his wife elbowed him hard enough to shift the folding chair. 8. While balancing a plate of funeral potatoes at the reception, a guest looked around the fellowship hall and said, "This is the most organized thing she's ever put together." Stress floods hearing and attention in grief, which is why cruel jokes feel louder and last longer than normal conversation. The widow stopped serving casseroles. The ladle hung in the air like evidence. 9. Near the memory table, a man picked up a photo from 1987 and grinned. I forgot he had that nose before the surgery. Nobody laughed because the dead man never had surgery. It was just his face in bright summer light. The daughter took the frame back with 2 hands, as if rescuing it from a sidewalk magician. 10. When the pastor said, "We are gathered here to honor a life," somebody in the back muttered. And to finally find out what he left everybody, foreheads snapped around at once. A purse zipper closed with military force. The guest book pen rolled off the table and hit the floor like a tiny judge's gavel. 11. Waiting beside the casket spray, a woman hugged the sister and said, "I always thought I'd outlive him too." It was not her brother. It was not about her. But there she stood, wearing that sentence like a corsage. The sister gave the thin smile people use when they are too tired to start a second funeral. 12. During the prayer, a man leaned down to ask the widow, "Be honest, did the life insurance make this a little easier?" People under stress can miss whole speeches and still hear one forbidden phrase with perfect clarity, especially when money is involved. Her jaw locked. 2 rows back, a relative dropped a program and did not bother picking it up. 13. As pallbearers lined up, one guest watched the casket pass and said, "That wood is nicer than my dining table." 6 men carrying a coffin do not want to hear product envy. The eldest son kept walking, face fixed forward. Behind him, the speaker system hummed softly, as if the building itself had chosen not to participate. 14. While everyone waited for the live stream to connect, a cousin squinted at the tablet on a tripod and joked, "Imagine missing this in person." The funeral home employee, who had spent 20 minutes helping an overseas daughter join, did not blink. On the screen, her frozen face stayed mid-sob. Nothing improves grief like being heckled by bad bandwidth. 15. At the visitation, a man stared at the polished casket and said he would have hated spending this much. He meant it as insight. It landed like theft. The widow kept both hands clasped over her purse. Motionless, a child's dropped candy wrapper skated across the floor under the pew. Even that had better timing than he did. 16. Before the choir began, 2 old co-workers looked toward the front row and one whispered, "So which one was the first wife again?" He did not whisper enough. The second wife heard every word while holding a white tissue already pulled to threads. The choir director raised a hand for the opening hymn like someone trying to stop weather. 17. While standing under the cemetery tent, a guest glanced at the dark clouds and said, "If this gets rained out, do we come back tomorrow?" Funeral schedules involve permits, cemetery crews, and time transport, which is why nobody on site found that remotely cute. The funeral director stared at him with the quiet patience of a man whose clipboard deserved better company. 18. Passing the display of military medals, a neighbor said, "I didn't know they gave those out that easy back then." The son, still in dress uniform, heard him from 2 feet away. He did not turn. He just straightened one photograph that was already straight. Some insults do not make a sound after they land. They just pull every shoulder tighter. 19. During the line to greet the family, a woman hugged the daughter and said, "You have your mother's eyes and your father's forehead." I'm sorry about the forehead. The daughter gave a blank nod because apparently Genetics Review Hour had opened between the lilies and the sympathy cards. Behind them, the coffee urn clicked on like it had bad instincts too. 20. Near the back pew, a man checked the printed order of service and said, "Only one song that's efficient." A funeral is a rare event where efficiency should not sound like praise. The pastor looked up from the pulpit. The programs rustled all at once. Even the stained glass sunlight felt like it had stepped into the wrong building. 21. While looking into the open casket, a distant relative said, "They almost got his mouth right." The embalmer, who had come quietly to pay respect, was standing beside the floral easels in a dark suit. He took exactly one slow breath. Across the room, the widow pressed a tissue to her face and stopped greeting people entirely. 22. After the eulogy, a guest leaned toward the brother and asked, "So who gets the boat now?" Grief narrows patience and widens outrage, which is why inheritance questions can turn one quiet hallway into a live electrical field. The brother looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then he walked away holding his coffee like it contained his citizenship. 23. At the reception buffet, someone lifted the foil from the ham tray and said, he'd be thrilled there's finally enough food for everybody. The dead man had spent years hosting family dinners. That was the joke. Apparently, nobody at the table moved. Steam rose off the potatoes in one slow cloud, as if the buffet itself wanted plausible deniability. 24. While the funeral home staff arranged flowers, a guest counted arrangements and muttered, "Somebody here is trying too hard to look sad." He said it facing a wall of cards signed by old neighbors, co-workers, and cousins. The widow's sister heard him, turned halfway, and stared until he suddenly found deep meaning in his own shoe. 25. Before the slideshow started, a man tapped the projector table and said, "Hope they cut the boring camping years." The first photo that appeared was the deceased teaching his daughter to fish at age 6. Nobody needed a speech after that. The projector fan kept whirring. On the screen, the lake looked calmer than the room. 26. When the hearse door opened, a family friend watched the pallbearers get into place and said, "You know, he never was one for carpooling." The line floated right across the driveway and into the silence people were working hard to maintain. One pallbearer shut the door harder than necessary. The chrome handle flashed like a warning label. 27. During the graveside prayer, a guest whispered, "How deep is this really? 6 feet exactly." Cemeteries vary by vault system, drainage, and local code, which is why funeral staff treat that question like plumbing, not comedy. The grounds crew kept their eyes on the straps. A widow in heels swayed once. Nobody volunteered him a measuring tape. 28. At the memorial table, someone picked up the framed recipe card and said, "This casserole was the one thing she never overcooked." He smiled after saying it, which made it worse somehow. Her daughter stared at him across a tray of store-bought rolls. The smile stayed on his face alone, bright and useless as a flashlight at noon. 29. While the organ music filled the chapel, a man slid into the pew and whispered, "This song was ruined for me by a cat video." The widow's niece slowly turned her whole head toward him with the calm expression of a person deciding whether jail would be worth it. Up front, the organ pipes kept doing honest work. 30. At the receiving line, a guest took both of the son's hands and said, "At least now Thanksgiving will be less political." It was technically about the deceased, and still somehow mainly about table convenience. The son let go first. 2 paper cups fell over near the coffee station. Even spilled creamer had more sympathy in it. 31. Before the cremation service began, a woman studied the brochure display and asked, "Do they really do group rates for couples?" The funeral director did not answer because professionalism has limits, and this one had found them. Beside the display, a vase of white roses stood perfectly still. Her husband slowly removed the brochure from her hand, like disarming fireworks. 32. While a nephew adjusted the microphone for the first speaker, an old neighbor called out, "Don't worry, Uncle Ray hated long speeches anyway." The first speaker was Uncle Ray's daughter. Holding 3 pages she had rewritten all night. Her hand paused on page 1. The microphone squealed once, tiny and cruel, before settling into place. 33. During the line past the casket, a man whispered, "This makeup is fighting for its life." Mortuary cosmetics are designed to flatten color loss under chapel lighting, which is why they always look different from ordinary makeup at arm's length. The widow heard every syllable. Her hand tightened around a rosary until the beads clicked together like teeth. 34. Near the photo collage, someone pointed at the deceased in a fishing vest and asked, "Was this before or after the DUI?" It was after a cancer surgery. Wrong crisis. Wrong decade. Wrong everything. The oldest daughter closed the album without a word. Across the room, a metal folding chair scraped back on the tile like a sentence being revoked. 35. While the choir filed out, a guest leaned over and said, "Strong service. Needed tighter editing." Nobody at a funeral wants a review from a man who sounds like he grades documentaries for a hobby. The choir robes brushed past in a quiet line. 1 page of the program folded inward and stayed that way, like the room had flinched. 36. As people moved toward the cemetery cars, a cousin looked at the lineup and said, "Nice turnout. Death is her best networking event." The widow was standing directly beside the limo door. She did not react outwardly. The chauffeur looked straight ahead with the expression of someone who had heard too much and was billing none of it. 37. By the guest book, a woman signed her name, circled it, and told the daughter, "Call me if you ever want to laugh about all this." The daughter glanced down at the still wet ink, then back at the casket, then nowhere at all. Some offers arrive dressed like comfort and still sit in the room like a wet shoe. 38. While the bagpiper adjusted his reeds outside, a man covered one ear and said, "This is why I support cremation. Reed instruments use pressure in resonance, which is why outdoor pipes cut through wind and conversation with surgical efficiency." The veteran's widow heard him before the first note began. Then the pipes started, and his sentence lost every fight left in it. 39. During the luncheon, someone bit into a dinner roll and announced, "She would have hated these flowers, but loved this butter." He said it with the satisfaction of a man solving a historical mystery. The 2 sisters at the table looked at the centerpiece, then at the butter packet, then simply kept eating to survive the hour. 40. At the church entrance, a guest saw the framed portrait on the easel and said, "That's the best picture they had." The portrait had been chosen because it was the one the widow loved most. She was standing close enough to smell his aftershave. The easel stayed upright. His wife did the emotional collapsing for both of them. 41. Before the casket closed, a distant uncle peered in and asked, "Did they fix the ear?" Nobody knew what he meant because nothing was wrong with the ear. He just had one of those minds that cannot leave a face uninspected. The funeral assistant reached for the lid hardware with the calm precision of a person ending a conversation manually. 42. While families were gathering coats after the burial, a man clapped the son on the back and said, "You handled that like a pro." The son had cried through half the service, carried the casket, and thanked 100 people without sitting down. Reducing all that to performance notes felt like handing a receipt to a storm. 43. At the reception table, somebody asked the widow, "So, are you staying in the house alone now?" Grief strips away the usual polite buffer, which is why practical questions can sound like eviction notices when timed badly. She set down her coffee with extreme care. Behind her, a spoon hit a saucer once and kept ringing. 44. After the pastor mentioned the deceased loved gardening, a man near the aisle whispered, "That explains the backyard looking like a hostage video." The grandson heard it, because apparently insults about hydrangeas now qualified as mourning support. He stared forward while his mother pinched the bridge of her nose. In the front, the flower spray glowed like an alibi. 45. Standing beside the hearse, a neighbor said, "He finally gets to ride in something expensive." It landed in the driveway with all the grace of a dropped toolbox. The widow did not even look over. Sunlight flashed across the hearse windows. The chrome was polished enough to reflect every bad choice back at full size. 46. While the honor guard folded the flag, a guest leaned toward another and said, "Nice triangle. Do they practice that shape?" The son in uniform heard it from 4 feet away and kept his face still by force. The folded flag rested in white gloves, exact and silent. Some people really do meet dignity and ask it stupid questions. 47. Near the visitation flowers, a woman hugged the sister and said, "At least you won't have to keep pretending his chili was good." The sister had spent 3 days planning this service and 1 decade making that chili with him. She blinked twice without speaking. Beside them, the sympathy cards in the basket suddenly looked like the mature guests. 48. Before the family slideshow, somebody asked, "Do we get the funny pictures or just the propaganda?" Memory videos compress a whole life into selected images, which is why mocking them in the room sounds like kicking at a bridge while people are crossing. The grandson shut the laptop halfway. Across the chapel, the screen glowed blue and patient. 49. At the cemetery tent, a man squinted at the folding chairs and said, "I've seen sturdier setups at youth soccer." The widow's brother, who had arranged the whole service during 48 sleepless hours, was standing within arm's reach. He turned 1 chair an inch straighter. The tent fabric snapped once in the wind like a warning flag. 50. During the line for coffee, a guest stirred cream into his cup and said, "You know he'd be late to this too if he could." The dead man had spent his life showing up early for everybody else. Nobody corrected the speaker. The spoon kept tapping ceramic. Even the coffee station sounded like it was losing patience. 51. While the family stood for a final prayer, a cousin leaned toward the widow and said, "You're taking this surprisingly well." She had not slept, had not eaten properly, and had thanked strangers through a swollen throat since morning. Her hands were shaking under the program. The church lights hummed overhead with the bored cruelty of fluorescent truth. 52. At the luncheon, someone set down a casserole dish and announced, "I mostly came because your neighborhood has good parking." It was an astonishing sentence to deliver while balancing sympathy macaroni. 3 women serving drinks stopped moving at once. The widow's niece smiled the dangerous, polite smile people use right before they invent an enemy. 53. Near the casket, a man looked at the folded hands and said, "They should have put his phone in there. He'd panic without it." Modern habits trigger social scripts fast, which is why people blurt familiar jokes even in places that cannot support them. Nobody around him accepted the invitation. The polished casket edge reflected his grin back. Smaller and worse. 54. As people filed past the photo board, a guest pointed to the honeymoon picture and said, "So this was before he got difficult." The widow turned toward that sentence like she had physically heard a glass break. The guest's smile disappeared halfway home. On the board, the beach photo kept doing quiet work none of them deserved. 55. During the graveside lowering, someone whispered, "I wonder if they level it with a machine after." The groundskeeper, holding his hat against the wind, heard him clearly and gave nothing away. Beneath the tent, everyone watched the straps move. Loose dirt sat piled nearby in full view. The machine was right there, and still the sentence felt extra stupid. 56. Before the final hymn, a woman adjusted her shawl and said, "I do love seeing old classmates even under sad branding." The deceased was her classmate too, which somehow made it more offensive rather than less. 3 pews forward, a man stopped dabbing his eyes and just stared. Nothing freshens grief like marketing language in a church. 57. While the funeral home attendant passed out memorial cards, a guest read the back and asked, "Do people actually keep these?" He was holding the answer in his hand, next to 2 women who had already tucked theirs into wallets. The attendant kept smiling because the job paid him to. The women did not. 58. At the chapel entrance, a man spotted the portrait easel and said, "That smile always looked fake to me." Camera smiles freeze muscle tension in odd ways, which is why old photographs often preserve effort as much as joy. The daughter stood beside the frame and heard him clearly. She lifted the portrait a little higher and did not reply. 59. While the pastor spoke about service and kindness, someone in the back whispered, "He still owed me $80. The amount was specific enough to make it catastrophic. Two heads turned. A woman in front of him sat up straighter without looking back. For the rest of the sermon, that unpaid $80 occupied more air than the lilies. 60. During the line to leave the cemetery, a guest watched a pallbearer wipe his eyes and said, "At least somebody got into character." The man had been the deceased's brother for 60 years. Character had nothing to do with it. The casket straps were still visible. Even the mud on the cemetery path looked ready to file a complaint. 61. Near the reception desserts, a woman cut a brownie and told the widow, "This is almost worth dying for." The widow gave one slow nod because there are moments when correcting a sentence would require more energy than remaining alive. Powdered sugar drifted onto the black tablecloth. The brownie tray kept sitting there, fully unashamed. 62. Before the first speaker approached the pulpit, a man in the third row muttered, "Please let this one know when to land the plane." The speaker was the deceased's son, holding a page with water spots from rewriting it at midnight. He heard enough to tense. The pulpit microphone clicked on like the room choosing sides. 63. While waiting for the burial to begin, a guest asked, "How long until the grass looks normal again?" Fresh sod, irrigation, and seasonal growth are exactly why new graves look different for months after service. The widow's sister stared at the patch of earth without blinking. The grounds crew kept their tools still, as if motion would make him continue. 64. At the visitation, someone hugged the nephew and said, "He really picked the worst week to die. Traffic was brutal." The nephew had flown across 2 states, chosen the music, written the obituary, and not complained once. He looked at the man like he had been handed a parking receipt at a fire. Then he stepped aside and let silence do the rest. 65. During the slideshow, a guest laughed too loudly at a photo of the deceased in a bad holiday sweater and said, "Now that is a man who lost several bets." The family had used that photo because it was beloved. The laugh bounced off the chapel walls and died alone on the screen. The sweater stayed louder than him. 66. While the widow stood greeting people, a woman leaned in and said, "You'll meet someone. You're still attractive." It was somehow both premature and insulting in 2 directions at once. The widow blinked once, lips pressed flat. Behind them, a basket of sympathy cards tilted slightly on the table like it also wanted to leave. 67. By the military photos, a guest whispered, "He wore that uniform better than he handled retirement." The deceased's son heard it while holding the folded flag his father had just been given. He did not speak. He just tucked the flag tighter under his arm. Some sentences should come with a bright orange cone around them. 68. At the reception line, a man asked the widow, "Do you think he knew it was the end?" In grief, the brain searches for detail control, which is why questions about final moments hit harder than most people expect. She looked past him to the photo display. A server set down fresh coffee cups 1 careful inch at a time. 69. When the funeral director invited people to take flowers home, one guest said, "Good, because I'm not letting these lilies die for nothing." The lilies were arranged around the casket of a man everyone had come to honor. 4 relatives were still standing there. He reached for the stems anyway, already looking like a thief in polished shoes. 70. During the chapel prayer, somebody's phone buzzed, and the owner muttered, "If that's him, I'm leaving." The joke hit the pews and fell flat on every single one. A woman in front covered her mouth with both hands. The phone buzzed again in his pocket, somehow embarrassed on his behalf. 71. While the family moved toward the cemetery cars, a neighbor looked at the hearse and said, "Black really is slimming." He was talking about a vehicle transporting a casket. The widow's cousin stopped mid-step, hand still on the limo door. Sunlight ran down the hearse panels in a clean line. The joke died harder than it deserved to. 72. At the buffet line, a guest lifted the foil off a tray and asked, "Did somebody make the dry noodles she loved, or are we honoring her badly too?" The daughter who had cooked them was standing right there holding serving tongs. She stared at him over steam and aluminum. Even the noodles looked insulted. 73. Beside the guest book, a man asked, "Is signing this legally important or just symbolic?" Guest books exist to record presence and support, not create any binding duty, which is why the funeral home staff did not dignify the question. The widow's brother kept turning pages for people behind him. The pen waited in its ribbon loop. Offended but stable. 74. Before the casket closed, a relative sighed and said, "I still think he'd have preferred cremation, less clutter." The widow had chosen burial because they had discussed it together for years. Her hand rested on the casket edge. The relative noticed too late. A hinge clicked softly, and suddenly the air had edges. 75. During the final hymn, a guest read the lyrics card and whispered, "This one drags in the middle." The choir was still singing it 6 feet away. 2 altos heard him and kept going because training is stronger than temptation. The hymn ended on a long-held note. His wife did not look at him once. 76. At the cemetery, someone studied the polished headstone sample book and said, "You can really tell grief has premium tiers." The widower was standing next to the funeral counselor, pen still in hand from signing forms. He did not answer. The sample granite squares sat on the table under the tent, reflecting gray sky and bad timing. 77. While the widow thanked people for coming, a man squeezed her hand and said, "You'll sleep great tonight after all this crying." It was not science, kindness, or even basic observation. Her mascara had long since surrendered, and she was still upright through sheer obligation. A tissue box on the table looked more qualified to speak. 78. Near the reception drinks, a guest asked, "Does grief burn calories because everybody looks exhausted?" Stress hormones affect appetite, sleep, and energy. But nobody holding a paper cup at a memorial needs that sentence as live commentary. 3 people stared at him over lemonade. The ice in the dispenser cracked once, perfectly on cue. 79. When the pastor invited anyone with a brief memory to share, a cousin stood up and began with, "I won't make this about me," which was already a lie in formal clothing. He then spent 2 minutes describing his divorce. The family stared forward like trained commuters. The microphone cable lay across the floor like a visible mistake. 80. As people moved past the photo display, a guest tapped one frame and said, "This was definitely his better side." The widow had chosen that exact photo because the smile in it once saved a hard week. She stared at the frame a moment longer after he moved on. The frame itself remained perfectly still and oddly dignified. 81. While the bagpiper packed up outside, a man told him, "You sounded exactly like the soundtrack to every foggy movie funeral." The piper looked at him, then at the family, then back at the pipes in his hands. Nothing about that instrument needed his review. The reeds went back into the case with more grace than the sentence had. 82. During the reception, a guest chewing roast beef announced, "Honestly, this beats most weddings." 3 heads turned from 3 different tables. The widow's nephew put down his fork very slowly. A flower centerpiece leaned slightly off-center between them, as if the table itself had shifted away from the comparison. 83. Before the burial, someone asked the groundskeeper, "Do you ever get used to this, or is it still weird?" Repeated exposure dulls surprise, not respect, which is exactly why cemetery crews tend to stay quiet and move carefully. The groundskeeper adjusted his gloves and said nothing. Behind him, the lowered vault waited under green artificial turf like a sealed instruction not to improvise. 84. At the chapel doors, a woman embraced the daughter and said, "At least now you can finally clean out that junk room." The junk room was her father's study, and half the room's contents were on the memorial table behind them. The daughter stepped back without answering. A candle flickered beside the photo as if it had heard enough. 85. While the hearse pulled away from the church, a guest watched it turn the corner and said, "Strong exit." He said it like he was reviewing theater blocking. The family stood in black coats under dull morning light, watching until the taillights disappeared. All he contributed was one unnecessary sentence and a visible cloud of breath. 86. During the visitation, a man hugged the brother and said, "You know, he always seemed healthier than the rest of you." Nothing comforts a grieving family like surprise rankings from the lobby. The brother looked down at the floor runner, then at the casket, then nowhere at all. Around them, flower cards kept their wording professional and brief. 87. Near the dessert table, a guest cut pie and said, "I hope this is the recipe she took to the grave because mine never tasted right." Her daughter had baked it from that exact recipe the night before. The serving knife stopped midair in her hand. The pie tin caught the fluorescent lights like a witness. 88. Before the first reading, someone whispered, "If I die, skip all this and just send a text." Ritual gives mourners sequence and shared attention, which is why dismissing it in the room sounds like kicking the ladder while people are still climbing down. The reader at the lectern took a breath and began anyway. Paper trembled audibly in her hand. 89. At the memory board, a man pointed to a vacation photo and said, "That trip must have finished him off." It had been taken 20 years before, and the cause of death was not remotely funny. The widow's niece turned the photo slightly away from him without a word. The pushpin held. Her patients did not. 90. During the line to greet the family, a guest patted the son's arm and said, "Well, at least funerals show who your real friends are." Then he immediately cut the line to leave early. 6 people watched him do both things in 1 minute. The exit door opened with a groan. Even the hinge sounded judgmental. 91. While people waited for the service to start, a cousin studied the floral spray and asked, "Who picked white roses that feels expensive and a little performative?" The widow had picked them because white roses were on her wedding bouquet. She was seated 10 feet away. The cousin found that out from the silence, not from words. 92. At the cemetery tent, a man nudged another and said, "Careful, these chairs look one prayer away from collapse." The family was currently praying in those exact chairs. One chair creaked as if auditioning for his joke. Nobody laughed. The minister kept speaking into the wind with the patience of somebody paid in emotional hazard. 93. Near the open casket, a guest asked, "Do they glue the eyelids, or is it more of a tape situation?" Mortuary preparation uses setting techniques designed to create a natural closed expression, which is not a sentence anybody needed unpacked beside the flowers. The widow's sister stepped between him and the casket. He finally discovered silence by force. 94. During the luncheon cleanup, someone stacking paper plates said, "He'd love how productive this has made everybody." The room had spent hours crying, praying, carrying, greeting, and eating cold ham under fluorescent lights. Productive was not the word. The stack of plates bent sideways in his hands. Even disposable tableware rejected the metric. 95. At the church entrance, a guest looked at the memorial donation sign and said, "Cash only would have been cleaner." The sign listed the local library because the deceased loved books. The daughter was refilling pens by the guest book when she heard it. She placed one pen down very carefully. The donation basket kept sitting there, offended and rectangular. 96. While the final blessing ended, a man near the back whispered, "This has real season finale energy." He was wearing a black tie and the expression of someone pleased with his own sentence. 2 women turned around at once. Up front, the casket spray did not move. Nothing in the room had agreed to become entertainment. 97. By the photo board, a woman pointed at a picture of the deceased holding a newborn grandchild and said, "This one almost makes him look soft." The grandchild's mother heard it with both hands wrapped around that same child, now older and wearing church shoes. She turned the frame slightly toward herself and ended the conversation without any language at all. 98. At the graveside, someone asked the funeral director, "So after everybody leaves, how long does the actual dirt part take?" Cemetery closeouts involve vault placement, backfill, grading, and safety checks, which is why staff usually discuss it only with family when necessary. The director adjusted his tie once. The wind moved the tent wall. That was the answer he earned. 99. During the reception coffee refill, a guest said, "I have to admit, this is the nicest church basement I've cried in." It was not praise enough to be charming and not absurd enough to be funny. 3 men in folding chairs looked up over foam cups. The coffee dispenser hissed softly, like it was trying not to laugh. 100. At the exit, while the widow thanked him for coming, a man said, "You did a beautiful job. I'm stealing some ideas." He meant the flowers, the photo table, the order of service. He still said it standing beside her husband's memorial portrait. The widow's hand dropped from the handshake first. The portrait kept smiling without consent. 101. As the chapel finally emptied, one last guest looked around at the folded chairs, the framed photos, the flowers, the extinguished candles, and said, "Well, at least nobody made it weird." 4 relatives were still within earshot. Nobody answered. A single program lay open on the pew behind him, as if the room had left him a written correction. A strange thing about funerals is that some people panic at silence so hard they start throwing sentences at it like loose gravel. What is the most bizarre line you have heard beside flowers, a guest book, or a framed photo? Subscribe for more public disasters in formal clothing.